Hey friends, so I'm in my studio today and I'm cutting out a binding for a quilt that I hope to have finished soon. And I'm cutting out a bias binding, and I thought this was a good opportunity for me to sort of talk to you about why I like to use a bias binding and then also show you how I make them, because I have a pretty simple way to make a bias binding. So the reason that I like to use a bias binding, I think there's actually a couple things. I'm a bit of a traditionalist, so I like to use a bias binding instead of a straight grain binding. But the other reason that I like to use a bias binding is because it's a much more sustainable approach and that it's going to last longer. So why is that? So when you cut a bias binding, of course the binding is on the bias, but once you press your binding and sew it onto your quilt, the fibers from the grain and the cross grain form a kind of an X, right? Running down the side of your binding, running down the side of your quilt. And that's going to last longer because when you use a straight grain binding, the threads run parallel to the edge of the quilt, and over time, it's just going to wear faster. Now, does that mean that you should not use a cross grain or a straight grain binding? No, it does not. If the quilt is going to be on a wall hanging, if it's not going to get used, maybe that's a great time to do it. But if it's a quilt that's going to get heavy use, if it's maybe for a baby, those are great reasons to consider using a bias binding. As well, if you have scalloped edges or curved corners, you're going to need to use a bias binding because a straight grain binding isn't going to go around those curves. So grab an 8.5 by 11 inch sheet of paper. I'm going to show you how I cut long strips of binding so you don't have to join. I mean, you're still going to have to join the seams, but you don't have to join quite as many. And I'm going to show you how I do that. We're going to do a little tutorial and then we're going to cut into some fabric. Okay, so I have an 8.5 by 11 inch sheet of paper here. I don't have anything on it. See, it's just a plain piece of paper. I want you to get the same. So we're going to pretend that this piece of paper is actually a width of fabric. This is one of your selvage edges. This is one of your selvage edges. So what we're going to do is we're going to start and we're going to take our fabric and we're going to fold the selvage edges together, just like that, right? Just as if this was a piece of fabric. What I like to do when I am working with fabric to find the, or to cut a bias edge or cut bias strips, I always square one edge. So I don't need to like do that because it's a piece of paper. But if you're working with a 1/2 yard, 5/8 yard, whatever piece of yardage that you have, find your straight grain along one side. So this is your fabric. You've got your selvages folded together and the fold in the middle. So you're going to take this and open it up. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take one of the corners. This is the width of your fabric. This is your selvage. You're going to take your fabric and you're going to fold like such. So you're folding your selvage to the width of fabric, right? This is a 45-degree angle that you've created. And by cutting and by folding this, what we're doing is we're actually finding this nice long strip that we're going to cut on the bias across the fabric. So you're going to fold it like that. And then you fold the fabric back on itself, keeping the fold together, keeping this 45-degree line together. Then you fold it again. Then you fold it again. And at the end, what you have is this weird little piece that looks like that. This is your bias. This is the bias, the fold where we have the bias. We're going to cut that off. And then we're going to just cut strips across this piece of fabric. Now, let's talk about why this works better, right? So if we were just cutting, if we go back to our original piece of fabric and we just cut these 45-degree angles across the fabric, what happens when you get up here is you end up with a funky angle. So if you cut a piece of bias going this way, you end up with an angle because you cut a piece of fabric that goes from here to the fold, and then it goes here. And let's assume that that's a strip, right? Well, then you have to cut this apart and sew it back on. You don't have to do that with this particular method, right? So take our fabric, we fold selvage edge to the width of fabric, we find the bias, and then we just fold this on top of itself until we're finished. All right, friends, so I have my fabric here and it's ready to go. And it occurred to me that there's one thing that I forgot to tell you that I did when I was showing you how to fold your paper a minute ago. So one of the things that I do when I am working to find the bias, or to cut my bias binding, I told you how I square up one side, and I do that. But the other thing I do is I cut off the selvage because I don't actually need it. So I just take my fabric, and this is nice and pressed, and I just cut off the selvage. It does not have to be exact. Fold it in half. Fold your fabric in half or quarters if you need to. Find a line on your ruler and just make sure that line follows the fold, and then just cut because you don't need the selvage. So my selvage is off. I have found the grain and cut the grain on one side. And if you don't know how to do this, I actually have a really fantastic class on Creative Spark. It's based on my first book, Piecing Makeover, which is all about fine-tuning your patchwork and troubleshooting. So if you don't know how to do it, that's a great resource. I'll link up to that. But cut off your selvage, find the grain. And then what I do is I open this up, just like I said, right? This is our paper. This is the fold right here. This is the center fold. Pardon me. And I take what was it's still what was the selvage edge, right? And I line it up against the grain. And by doing that, I create a 45-degree angle here. And then I fold that on top of itself, right? By doing that, I'm creating this nice long strip. And I fold the fabric on top of itself again. And then again. Then at the end, you have this little packet. So one of the things I do is I take my ruler and I'm chop off, I don't know, about 1/4 of an inch on the fold. I don't need this fold. This fold doesn't do me any good over here. The folds aren't always exactly on top of one another. So this just gives me a nice straight line. A good place to start. So I cut that off. That goes into my scrap bag. So now what I do is I'm going to cut along this entire piece of fabric. I like to cut a 2-inch binding. I like a really nice, small, tight binding. If you're just starting, stick to 2.5. If you like to machine, if you like to finish your bindings on a machine and sew them down, 2.5 might be better. But for me, I'm cutting 2. And again, this is all comfort. So I'm comfortable with a 2. If you're comfortable with cutting a 2-inch binding, do that. If not, cut it whatever width works for you. So before I cut this first strip, remember, this was that fold, right? So this was that long piece of bias that we're going to get. So when you cut your first strip, when you open it up, look at that nice long piece of bias right there. This really long piece of bias. So this is about 38, 39 inches. That's pretty fantastic. So what I'm going to do is just continue cutting until I have all of these strips cut from my fabric. And this actually makes a lot of bias strips. I like to keep my extra bias binding. I actually have a bucket, a clear bucket, with all my extra bias binding. So if I'm making a small project, a mug rug, something that just needs a little tiny binding, I go there because I often have something that will work and I don't have to cut any new bindings out. And I'll just give it a nice press and then keep on using it. But for this is how I cut these and get nice long strips on the bias. Anyways, I hope that you have enjoyed this. I hope you have learned something. I hope that if you want to start tackling bias binding, this gives you the confidence to do so. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask.